You don't have to be a rocket scientist or a doctor to realize that a body that has no energy is called a cadaver. A body that has a lot of energy is called healthy. When people get fatter, we tell them they eat too much. They have too much energy. Does that make any sense from a thermodynamic standpoint? Absolutely not.
What would you say is the biggest myth that people have about going out in the sun?
That the sun is toxic. That is absolute, utter nonsense. If it was, the taxpayer pays huge amounts of money to the NIH. I'll give you the perfect example because you guys have learned this more than not. 98% of the NIH budget goes to studying the DNA and RNA genome. So guys like Craig Ventner, that started back in the 1990s when Clinton was the president, they got all the press. That goes all the way back to Watson and Crick. It goes back there. And it turns out, where should the money be going? To the other genome that's in our cells, called the mitochondrial genome, because that's the one that makes all energy in our body. And you don't have to be a rocket scientist or a doctor to realize that a body that has no energy is called a cadaver. A body that has a lot of energy is called healthy. So guess what we should be focusing in on? The genome that makes all the energy. And here's the shocking thing. The DNA and RNA genome has about 22 to 25,000 genes in them currently today for a human. And guess what we've known from the get-go? We have 37 genes in the mitochondria. Don't you think it'd be a little bit easier to tackle 37 genes than it would be to do 25,000, considering that 13 of the 37 genes are solely tied to making energy in a mitochondria? But we don't do that.
Right. Okay, so speaking of mitochondria, most people learned about that in ninth grade biology. Millie's taking it this year. She just did her little diagram of her eukaryotic cell, and there it is. We learn it's the powerhouse of the cell. So explain to me what the next step and the next level of thinking is that is making it clear that mitochondria is the real area of focus if we're concerned about health.
It's actually simple. It's energy. When you have a mitochondria that don't function with as high an efficiency as it should in a healthy new child, diseases show up. In fact, that's actually how diseases manifest. As energy production in the mitochondria drops, diseases manifest. Is that Jack Kruse's observation? No, it's Doug Wallace's observation. He's probably the world researcher that's done more for mitochondrial biology than anybody else. He's at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. He's been doing this for over 40 years. He's the guy that figured out we only get our engines from our mom. So that means mitochondrial DNA is only inherited from one parent. That's pretty cool stuff. That's not true with DNA or RNA. Not only that, the wiring diagram for the mitochondria actually sit awfully close to some of the key features of DNA and RNA. He's made the case for quite a long time that size and shape changes in the mitochondria link to energy production. Now, most people, and he's guilty of this too, he hasn't really done a good job, I think, telling clinicians this, but you've heard me say all the time that I can teach a third grader, hey, what happens to your ankle when you twist it? Does it get bigger or smaller? It gets bigger. What happens to your heart when you get heart failure? Does it get bigger or smaller? It gets bigger. What happens to a star in space when it's dying? Does it get bigger or smaller? It gets bigger. So guess what? Right there, we see three different examples of where energy is lost, things get bigger. But yet, when people get fatter, we tell them they eat too much. They have too much energy. Does that make any sense from a thermodynamic standpoint? Absolutely not. So that's why my perspective is different than most doctors, because they don't fundamentally understand mitochondria. And the reason they don't is because they're taught a curriculum that focuses on what? DNA and RNA. So can you ever get to the truth if you never look under the right stone? And why is it that we're looking under that stone? Might it be that the people who are in charge of the algorithms that began with the Flexner report don't want us to look in the right place? Is that potentially why we're being taken advantage of for as long as we have, and why every decade that goes past us in medicine, it gets harder and harder to be a contrarian, to be the salmon that swims upstream. And I think when you examine some of the things that I talk about, these things are really not hard. I mean, before we did this interview, you were very concerned about me getting too technical and this and that. I've already explained to you how mitochondria work, and I don't think I even used the words autophagy and apoptosis yet.
Not one time.
And the thing is, you don't need to know that.
Yeah.
I think the public needs to know that they need to become black swan mitochondriacs, because if you focus on the mitochondrial genome, even if your doctor ignores it, you will get better in spite of your doctor. And that's okay. And, you know, I have one of my members came to see me this week in Destin for his farm visit, and I told this was one of the coolest things I think that's ever happened on a farm visit. This farm member has had a massive transformation in his health and, you know, in his body and how he looks. And he's an older guy, you know, he's in his 60s. His doctor sent me a note. By the way, I have problems with tinnitus and things like this. Is there anything Dr. Cruz can send me? And I chuckle, but I actually said to the farm member, I said, you want to know something? This is a doctor that you probably want to keep. You know why? Because he's open-minded enough to know that what his patient learned from me was really successful. He couldn't help that patient. And he's looking now for more information. Is there something that he didn't learn in medical school? Most people, especially Americans, hear this story and we'd be furious at that doctor. Well, here's the part of the story I haven't told you. He's Canadian. So is the doctor. So that's a total different aspect. And I think when you actually think about medicine, and me being a surgeon, the word surgeon, what does it mean? It means to teach. And, you know, if you would ask me the first 25 years of my career, that's not how I looked as a surgeon. I was more like a mechanic for the brain and the spine. Now I look at my role completely different. Now people want to sit and talk to me and do interviews like this and ask questions why my perspective is so different than everybody else. And for you guys on the public side, you want to get this message out. You find it very difficult to talk to your friends, your family, people you work with, say, why do you guys wear funny glasses? Why do you wear sunglasses at night and you don't wear any sunscreen during the day, and you sit out in the sun and you try to do things completely opposite what the dermatologist or the ophthalmologist would tell you? Because guess what? It turns out when you do that, you actually get better. You actually don't rely on some of the canned ideas, treatments, drugs, I mean, whatever you want to call it, that people have been peddling for 70, 80, 90 years. And then when you get to be a real skeptic, like hopefully some physicians who watch this will be, you go back and look at the data and say, you know, why is it? Why did the dermatologist get a pass and never answer the question? Why is it that people who have the lowest vitamin D levels have the most skin cancer, the most melanoma? I mean, let's face it. If you have a low vitamin D level, it means you're not in the sun, right? But yet, those are the people that tend to get the cancers. That should stop you dead in your tracks and go, why am I putting the sunscreen on? What's the link to the sunscreen? Then you find out that sunscreen's a $6 billion industry in North America.
Yeah.
And then you go, oh, so without sunscreen, you might not need to go to the dermatologist. How's that for irony?
What would you say is the biggest myth that people have about going out in the sun?
That the sun is toxic. That is absolute, utter nonsense. If it was, every wild animal and all these beautiful trees around us would have every rip-roaring disease, and it turns out we're the only animal on this planet that has chronic disease epidemics. And what do? We come out of our mama, we wear clothes, we wear sunglasses, we have sunscreen, sun cream for the people in the UK. It's almost ludicrous. If you took your 3 children to, you know, one of the farms that are up here, and you saw a baby horse or a baby pig being born, would they come out with Abercrombie and Fitch on it? Like you put in your baby before you take baby pictures? Is there any animal that does what humans do? Maybe we need to start asking those questions right then and there. Maybe we need to start questioning anything. I mean, one of the big questions that that got me down this path, I have to tell you, I told some of these guys this weekend. I remember distinctly waking up in New York City, going to high school. I would always go out with a wet head. At the time, I used to have curly hair like Robert Plant from Led Zeppelin, and it used to go down the back of my head. I would go out with it soaking wet. It would make my coat wet, and I'd ride to school on the subway. In between the subway cars, and my hair would freeze. Every day, my mom was convinced I was going to have pneumonia. I was going to die. Turned out, when I was that age, I was the only one in the house who never got sick. Even living in New York City, traveling in a subway, that's the effect of cooling on your head. You know, that's something called cold thermogenesis. Well, let's fast forward now 30 years. I'm a neurosurgeon. What do I do when someone gets their head bashed in? I cool their head to improve their function. Why? Because it actually makes mitochondria a more thermally efficient heat engine. How about that? So guess what? The same principle that I didn't even know I was doing at 14 years old, actually now at 55, people are paying me money for it. And when I teach people to use it for different diseases, that now their primary care doctor will say, oh, well, you know, this, we're not talking about your head kicked in, we're talking about you having diabetes, or we're talking about you having obesity. It won't work for that. Well, it won't? Tell me why it won't. And they can't. And, you know, it's the height of ignorance and arrogance for someone to not examine the science behind something and then go out and tell the public, oh, this won't work. It's absolutely, and I'll tell you, it's an epidemic in medicine right now. Huge epidemic. Yeah. And I always tell people it's the mark of an educated mind to take something you fundamentally do not believe. So any physician watching this who doesn't believe that the sun is helpful for health, you need to hold that concept in your mind. Go examine it. Go look at all the papers that are out there. You might be shocked at what you find. You may find that what you learned at Harvard, Yale, Cornell, UCSF, UC San Diego, any place you want to go, all of those places, the medical curriculum is subsidized by Big Pharma. Shocker.